First of all, thank you to you, Suzanne, for joining us tonight. I know that this is actually a very difficult time in the morning for you right now, isn't it? It looks like you've got the sort of sunset outside, but am I correct in thinking that it's the middle of the night?
Yes, this is 2 o'clock in the morning, Yukon time, and this is about as dark as it gets at this time of year. So,
Wow, wow. Well, thank you for coming along. I have to say, you have the most incredibly topical film for the time that we're currently in. I think when I watched your documentary and saw the opening of, the average grocery store only having 3 to 5 days food, I think this is something that's been going through everyone's mind right now in terms of the coronavirus. So you must be very glad that you're kind of prepared and tucked away in a nice, safe place prior to this crisis, because you couldn't have foreseen that something like this would have occurred.
no, exactly. I had no idea, of course, that we would be in this kind of global pandemic crisis so quickly after doing this experiment. But I did feel incredibly fortunate when COVID hit. I mean, in the fall, I still stocked my house with a year's worth of food. So when it came to Canada, and people were worried about stocking up from the grocery store, I didn't have to worry at all. I didn't have to go to the grocery store. So I felt very, very prepared, but um, it's an unfortunate circumstance, of
It's
course,
an unfortunate
to be
circumstance.
prepared for. Yes.
So you're still eating local?
I am still eating, I would say 95% local. A few things have come back into my life, like chocolate. um, but yeah, no, I just, by the end of it, it was just so great that I really, like, I truly didn't want to stop. And so I've tried to keep going as much as I can. My family, well, as you saw, we're not quite as what's the word, charmed with the whole experience as I was. So they have brought grocery store food back into our house. And I would say though that they still probably eat 75% local. So all our meat and our fish, all our dairy, all our eggs, all our vegetables, all our berries are still all local to Dawson.
Is that tempting for you, having the grocery food brought back into the house after all of
Yeah,
that time?
yeah, not actually. I forced myself to taste some things when the year was over. Like I just didn't, I just had no interest. It was so interesting, not what I expected at all. And but I did force myself to taste some things that I hadn't had for a while. And really overall they were quite disappointing. Like I could still kind of remember the tastes and they were still the same, but they weren't as good as I had thought they would, especially bread products. Bread products were really bland for some reason.
Well, you did talk about your taste buds changing over time as the film went on. I think one of the things that was really fascinating to me is the sheer amount of labour that you had to do when preparing food. Like a lot of the documentary, we're watching you just slaving away for these really long hours in the kitchen. But on top of that, you're trying to direct a film starring yourself as well. Like, how did you manage to juggle these two things? Because it's really quite a remarkable effort when you think about everything you've put together to create this film.
Yeah, I really have no idea. When I look back on it, I don't actually know how I managed to find enough hours in the day, but somehow I did. And on top of that, which even made it more difficult, was I was doing all the filming. So I was actually filming myself, which is really not easy to be on both sides of the camera at the same time. So yeah, it was several full-time jobs all at the same time.
So, how did you do that? Did you just have a camera on a stand?
Yeah,
I've
I
filmed myself before. That's so difficult. I can't imagine doing that on top of all of the food preparation that you did and still coming up with an absolutely stunning documentary.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if you pay close attention to the credits, I gave the tripod an assistant camera credit in the film because it was essential, of course, the tripod. But yeah, it's tricky because you have to frame the shot when you're not in it, so you really pay attention to what's in the background. and then a lot of times then you have to kind of do a bunch of test shots to see if you're actually in the frame at all, and then you have to adjust the frame but without you in it. So it's definitely more time consuming for sure.
So what percentage of the day did you spend preparing food and cooking? Because you always talk about it being a lot of time. How much time was it?
Yeah, I mean, almost, well, at first it was almost all the time because I was just, I went into it as a blank page, you know, like I wasn't really a great gardener. I didn't know how to forage, and I really wasn't a cook. Like I really tended to avoid the kitchen before this project. So not, you know, there were some basic skills that I was lacking. And then on top of that, having to become really creative because not having some of the standard ingredients, and then having to make everything from scratch. So you know, you have something that requires butter. Well, first you have to make the butter. So you know, and before you can make the butter, you have to skim the cream off the milk, and et cetera, et cetera. So like everything had all these multiple layers. So at first it was crazy. Also, I thought I would start at a time of plenty. That made sense to me. But what I didn't realize is the time of plenty is the exact same time that you have to store everything for an entire year. So on top of learning all these new skills and doing a heck of a lot of cooking from scratch, I was also having to gather and store and process food for the whole year. So it was utterly crazy. But once I got past the growing season and past the fall, then everything kind of started to fall into place. And then I wasn't spending absolutely every waking minute preparing food. Then it really became more of a routine, and I think that, you know, you could really, well, I still do it, and I still have a full-time job, so you could do it once you learn how.
Oh wow,
And
you're doing
proof,
that in a
and
full-time
proof.
job. Because a documentary is a little bit gendered as well, in that you're doing a lot of the work and then you're struggling to get people to do the dishes to help you. That must have been hard.
Well, you know, I had no leverage with my family really because, as you saw, they were conscripted into this. They didn't jump on board voluntarily. So, you know, I couldn't use what I'm sure people who homesteaded and in times gone by, you know, would have said, well, if you want to eat, you have to help. You know, I mean, in this case, I couldn't use that line because it was all my idea. So it was a tricky balance, I think, preventing family mutiny. But I must say, although you don't see it in the film, my husband did cook every other supper.
Oh,
So
it's good.
I do have to give him credit for that.
Were you just taking a night off the filming?
Yeah, I was still there filming, but yeah, doing other stuff, probably preparing the butter.
Because this documentary's been very successful, hasn't it? Won the Rogers Audience Award at Hot Docs, which is the top 5 films. And one of the things that really carries, I think, your documentary through is just how cute and magical the relationships are with your family coming on that journey. But this is not your first film about Yukon and living out in the wild with your family, is it? You made All the Time in the World as well, about the journey of moving there and what it was like to leave city life. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So All the Time in the World was a time when we took our kids when they were 7 years younger. So they were 10, 8, and 4. And we went and lived in the Yukon wilderness for 9 months over the winter with no electricity or running water or internet or phone service. And most importantly, not a single clock or watch. And it just, yeah, the film just sort of carries one through what happened.
So, what's the next crazy experiment for your family then?
Well, I'm keeping that one very close to my chest. I think that I might have promised them after All the Time in the World that I wouldn't film them again, and then broke that promise. So, but you know, they are getting older. Sam is now in his second year of university, and Kate is about to go to university in the fall if COVID allows her to. So yeah, my opportunity to film them is getting less. Although I did joke that maybe a film about following a young woman at her first year of university during COVID times would be really interesting, but it did really get a lot of, a lot of positive feedback there. So I don't know, maybe I'm just gonna have to follow that crazy husband around of mine at some point next, but we'll see.
I think it's brilliant how you've managed to intertwine the two, and it really creates this, interesting dynamic. I think that makes it fascinating to watch, and it looks like your children actually learned a lot from this experiment, and that they went on a bit of a journey from it being a hard and a lot of work to really appreciating the opportunity to have the experience, and I'm sure it'll be something that's quite formative in their lives. We've got some questions coming in. We've got Denise has said that her son and her have just finished watching the documentary and they loved it. And he really loved watching what you cooked. I have to admit, when I was watching what you cooked, some of it, the blood and the mud, I was just having almost like a visceral reaction to your attempts to get salt. But his question is, interestingly enough, what did the mousse taste like, the mousse nose?
Oh, the moose nose. Well, moose nose, I can equate that most to trying to eat an eraser. That's kind of the texture, and there is not a lot of flavor. It's mostly the flavor of the campfire. So it's really interesting. Like moose nose is a delicacy for the Trondakwichen elders, and but it's definitely an acquired taste for those of us who haven't grown up with it. I would say the rest of the moose is entirely delicious. The moose nose I still have to work on.
So are you going to eat it again, or?
Oh, I have eaten it again for sure. Yeah, and I'm still working on that acquired taste. It hasn't quite moved to the delicacy realm yet, but I'm still working on that. I do think it's just so important to make use of all parts of the animal, and there is so much nutrition and flavor in beyond the roasts and the steaks. So it's yeah, that was a really interesting thing to become aware of. So like moose bones, for example, oh my gosh, so much flavor in those. Like that's a favorite. Moose bone broth. You can boil them, I think, 3 or 4 times and still get great flavor out of it.
Wow, I don't think we don't have any moose here, unfortunately. But I'm just loving your sheer determination. I will eat it until I like it as a food philosophy. Because the blood and the mud, like it was almost for a certain portion of the film, you were almost obsessed with salt and um, trying to create it. That looked disgusting. Did you actually keep using that on your food, or was it a thing that you tried and then stopped?
Yeah, the mud, I mean, it just kind of became a bit of a challenge, I think, to try and figure out how in our landlocked environment we could possibly find some kind of salt. And it was
Sorry,
really
my cat running across my keyboard is the
it was really, the mud was really interesting, just how salty it actually tasted when you evaporated it down. But I could never get rid of the mud taste, so that was very impractical. Um, and I really think the blood is actually, got the most promise. I mean, animal blood. I just want to be clear on that. If an animal is being harvested, it would be animal blood. There would be no blood donor clinic in my town collecting people blood for salt. But yeah, and there is a ton of nutrition in blood. And I've had things subsequently, not during that year, but subsequently, I've had the most delicious chocolate mousse made with blood, and it was really, really good. Yeah, I mean, and chocolate too, of course. But yeah, delicious. So yeah, I think there's a ton of nutrition in blood, but we haven't been sprinkling it on our food recently.
I swear you must have the world's most tolerant children. that, that, that scene with your husband giving the blood and then turning that into salt was, I think your documentary temporarily turned from, I guess, kind of a sort of environmentalist concern to a sort of fear factory. It's very, very, very creative. So are you working on anything now in terms of documentaries, or are you waiting till this project that to be announced?
Yeah, no, I'm working on a short film now, focusing on Kate, temporarily called Corona Grad, because she is going through this time of life where, you know, you're supposed to be transitioning into adulthood, and the rug has just been pulled out from under her. You know, no ability to get her driver's test, no ability to have her normal grad ceremony, no ability maybe to go off to university. So yeah, I've been filming her during this time, and thinking of turning that into a short film, but no big projects because I still I mean, this First We Eat is just kind of starting to get out in the world, and we'll continue to do more festivals in the fall. And I would really like to stay with this film for for a while.
Well, it's a
But
beautiful film.
I was just going to say, speaking of the kids, like what's really interesting is this summer, because the usual summer jobs aren't available for them. They're working for local farmers, and Sam is actually out now foraging for morel mushrooms, which are quite precious and bring him a good price. So they're spending their summer jobs with the production of food, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, it must be interesting for them because, to be fair, they probably thought you were a little bit crazy when you talked about the local food for the whole year. I'm just thinking from like a teenager perspective. And then
Yeah.
coronavirus must have come along and they must have been like, Mum was right, you know, that we really need to think about food security.
Well,
Um,
I wouldn't say they're quite old enough yet to say mom was right ever, but maybe in another 5 years. I'll hear them. Yeah.
so we've got a question in from Matthew, and he's asking, did this experiment affect your relationships with your friends, extended family, neighbours, children's friends, and teachers?
Well, there was a great amount of curiosity about the experiment. My children would come home and tell me how they would be trading their lunch with classmates because the classmates really liked the dried meat and they were quite happy to have whatever was in their classmates' lunch boxes. And it did become, you know, a topic at a lot of supper tables, which was kind of cool. It did interfere a little bit, I would say, with our social life because so much of a social life revolves around food. And at the beginning of the experiment, I wasn't sure we were going to have enough. So the idea of inviting a lot of people over to eat was a bit anxiety provoking at first. As time went on, then I began to do that more and more, which was great. And of course, people were reluctant to invite us over because there was really nothing that we could eat. But sometimes we were invited into a potluck where we would bring a dish that was entirely local. And it was pretty cool that some other people would try making entirely local dishes as well, which was kind of cool.
That's awesome. I'm glad that you are sharing that experience with other people because I think it is going to become very important in the future for us to think about food security. And, you know, obviously with coronavirus, everyone's thinking about where things come from.
Yeah.
We just got another question in from Ali, and she's wanting to know, this is a very New Zealand question, who was the Kiwi bee man that we saw and heard?
Yeah, that's David McBurney, and he. I wish I could remember the name of the place that he is from in New Zealand, but he spends his half the year here in Dawson and half the year back in New Zealand. So he just actually got back. He's a placer gold miner here and started up beekeeping, and he's the I believe the most northern person in our part of the world, in North America, who successfully overwintered bees. So that's pretty much something. They
I
make
was quite
delicious honey.
surprised that they survived, actually, like sitting out there with the wrapping around them, and because it gets really cold there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What temperature does it drop to in the Yukon territory?
Minus 40 for sure. That's Celsius. And sometimes down to, I think the coldest I've seen is minus 51 Celsius. But for sure, you know, many weeks of in the minus 40s. So yeah, it's difficult to keep bees all winter, but he managed to do it. That was the first year that he had overwintered them, and ever since he's managed to successfully overwinter. So that's great. So I continue to have local, I guess it's Yukon, New Zealand honey, I suppose, since he's a Kiwi.
I think because this is New Zealand and we're quite small, everyone will be thinking that they know him.
Yes, well, maybe they do.
So you're originally a doctor, aren't you? Is that right? What
Yes.
inspired you to get into filmmaking? Like, what was the journey behind picking up a camera and getting so good at it as well? Like, I mean, your previous documentary won a lot of awards as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was actually inspired to get into filmmaking by following the footsteps of my 5-year-old son. When Sam was 5, he started doing some stop motion animation, and I started helping him a little bit how to figure that out. And I got bit by the bug, and then yeah, never looked back really. So yeah, I follow in the footsteps of my kids. My kids all won awards for their short films well before I ever did.
That's amazing. What a talented family.
Yeah, yeah, they're great.
Were there any other documentary makers that influenced your approach to documentary?
Um, well, I really enjoy documentaries that have humor, and I really enjoy documentaries that are more narrative in their storytelling as opposed to the more journalistic classic documentaries. So I love it when people are creative with documentaries. There's a Canadian filmmaker who did a documentary called The Amina Profile back in 2015. That was the same time that All the Time in the World came out, so I can't say that she influenced me, but if you get a chance to see that film, the opening of that film, I think is just one of the greatest openings of any documentary. It's really super interesting. So I love the scope there is within documentary to be super creative and make them in very different ways. And I love when people can add humor for sure.
I just love the way that your whole approach and your whole philosophy is completely community led. And even your journey as a documentary maker, that's really something quite special, I think, that you've got there. And quite a special family. And I'm sure we'll see a lot more content about them.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would say a really special community. I mean, well, you got to witness it in First We Eat, but also from a filmmaking point of view. I mean, we're 1,500 people in this community, and we're quite isolated from anywhere else. And there's an amazing art and culture scene. So after, my kids got the interest going, then it was really this community that taught me to be a filmmaker, which I think that's pretty cool. 1,500 people, there we go.
and that was a wonderful thing in your film too that I don't think we had time to touch on, but was the relationship with the First Nations, Indigenous people that you brought into the film, and really talked about the relationship with the kind of worldview of food security and eating local, and its relationship to the way things have been historically there. I thought that was really beautiful the way that you did that.
Yeah, thank you. The Trondheim are, an integral part of this community, and they were here. This is their community, and we, the settlers, arrived uninvited at some point, but have always been welcomed. And I think it's just, I really love this aspect of this community of how welcoming Trondheim have been, and how willing they are to share their culture and their knowledge, and it's celebrated in the community. The whole community will go to a community feast, and in our school, the Han language is taught as a course up until grade 7, I believe. So yeah, it's a really amazing. I think it's I mean, there have been struggles, of course, with residential school and all the issues of colonialism, but I think that Dawson and the Tronderquichin are doing really well. It's a self-governing community, one of the first in Canada, self-governing First Nation, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I love the way that they gave you the eggs out of the offering as well to, you know, really, I guess, appreciate your project and what it is that you're trying to do in terms of teaching people, because it's not just about food security. It's about looking after our land and preserving it for future generations, and making sure that we have a planet that is going to be good for us all.
Yeah,
So
sure.
another question here from Richard, and he wants to know, was all the food paid for, and was it more or less expensive than buying from the store?
Yes, I did buy I mean, the food that we didn't gather or hunt or fish ourselves, I did purchase from the local farmers. And it was a little bit more expensive than buying it from the store. Not a huge lot, but slightly.
But did you save money overall from everything that you'd foraged and
No, I think, you know, I mean, it's a little hard to tell, of course, but I would say we would have, at the very best, come out equal.
well, that's good. Because it must have been quite terrifying when the food went, some of the food went rotten halfway through the winter.
Yeah, and it was just, you know, one thing when you're doing something like this is you really don't want to waste anything. You know, like nothing went down the drain. If I cooked potatoes, the potato water became soup stock, and the whey from making cheese, you know, was used for soup stock or tenderizing moose meat, or like everything just got repurposed and repurposed. So there was hardly any waste. There was virtually no recycling because there's no packaging, and yeah, very little waste. So yes, so you do want to make use of everything for sure.
I think you did a fabulous job at that. Is there any favourite recipes before we go that you could pass on to the audience? I'm sure everyone would love to try their own little bit of eat local.
Yes. Oh well. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what you produce in New Zealand. I was hoping that I could be there for Dock Edge because I've always wanted to come to New Zealand, and then I could have learned, but I'll have to save that for another time, unfortunately, thanks to this crazy pandemic. But yeah, delicious things that continue to be family favorites. So well, this could do for a roast moose, but also a pork roast, but using, well, for us, birch syrup, because we don't have maple trees. I don't know if do you have any kind of trees that you can use sap into syrup in New Zealand?
I'm probably not the person to ask that question.
Okay, well, anyway, roast moose or roast pork smothered in birch syrup and Saskatoon berries and garlic is delicious. I love birch syrup ice cream. I love a salad dressing just made from blending berries, frozen berries, garlic, and birch syrup in the blender. Yeah, those are some classic favorites, I would say, that have stuck with us. A lot of them have to do with birch syrup because it's just such an amazing thing, which maybe you don't have, so I shouldn't go on and on, but yeah, it's definitely become a favorite.
I'm not sure, actually. I don't think I've ever tried to get syrup out of trees, but I'm sure there will be something that,
Something
yeah.
to check out. Yeah,
Might
but I
have
mean,
to
you
put a
must have
yeah.
amazing opportunities in New Zealand for local food. I would presume.
Yes, we do have a wild food festival, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that will be inspired for some domestic tourism to that after watching your film to get out there and talk to people. Well,
Yeah.
Sue, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here. And have you got any final remarks for people watching, or?
Well, a big thank you to Doc Edge, of course, for bringing the film, and hello New Zealand. It's wonderful to kind of be with you virtually. And I would say, you know, I hope one of the take-home messages of the film is just for people to um, pay a little more attention to the labels on their food when they buy it at the store and see where it comes from, and to maybe think of, you know, if something comes from far away, maybe not choosing that and finding something local instead. You know, I certainly found that I was way more adaptable than I thought I was, and that I was surprised at the variety and flavor of local foods that I could find here so close to the Arctic Circle. And so I'm sure in New Zealand there's so many delicious local foods that can be had. And also that idea of eating seasonally is just, it's joyous really. And because every time you eat something, it's in its peak of flavor, so everything is delicious, and then you don't get to eat it for a while, and when it comes back again, it's just such a treat. So I would encourage people to look at labels when they buy food, and try increment by increment to buy more local to your country.
I think it's such a good message for people because it really supports local communities going through a hard time, and also, you know, really reduces the toll on the planet in terms of the carbon emissions for flying the goods to you, and the cost on the environment. So thank
Yeah.
you.